welcome to Puritans and Prejudice, a deep dive into the Salem witch trials. I'm your host, Allison Taylor, and today we will be exploring the ominous and very real dystopian tragedy that is the Salem witch trials. When I think of the witch trials, the first two words I think of are rights and responsibility, which was ironic because they were quite the opposite. The trials deprived people of rights and had a clear lack of responsible and reasonable action, but it was this lack of rights and responsibility that led to us having the rights we have today. But how did the people of Salem get to this point? What drove them to such extreme paranoia that they started slaughtering the innocent? Well, the answer lies in between the lines of old records and through the eyes of those in the past. Salem traces its founding to 1626. It was one of the first permanent settlements and where all of this takes place. These settlers were primarily fishermen. Some had settled in Gloucester, Massachusetts first before they moved further along the coast of Salem, making it somewhat the focal point of Massachusetts. The settlement remained very tiny until 1630 when a man named John Winthrop brought the Winthrop fleet, the so-called Great Migration of Puritans, to Massachusetts. Back over in England, the king was giving out charters to colonies. These charters were basically permission slips to build a cooperation. They were rare because you needed the king to personally allow you to be a cooperation, so there were very few in Europe. The Puritans formed the Massachusetts Bay Company and got a royal charter. This charter gave them land in the New World. This was a way for them to facilitate building Massachusetts. What was unique about the Massachusetts charter versus other royal charters is that this one did not specify where the meetings for the cooperation needed to be held, and also gave them tons of power. So while almost everyone else had to hold their meetings over in England, they held their meetings in Massachusetts, and they were also able to facilitate their own finances, as well as put people on trial without consulting the king. It was almost its own independent country. They went as far as not flying the flag of England to show their independence. So when they started creating the Puritan Church, they could do so without even consulting the Church of England. However, since the church leader and the government leader were the same person, this new religion of Puritanism could be considered treason. So the Puritans would be getting arrested, which put the people of Massachusetts in constant fear of being imprisoned for treason. When the Puritans came to Massachusetts, they were met by the natives living in the Salem area because they were already there for centuries. The settlers and the natives often had contentious relationships. For the Puritans specifically, they saw any religion that was not Christianity as worshiping the devil. And that, yeah. And this included the Native American religions. They automatically began to view the native people as their enemies. This view would lead to very real violence throughout New England in a series of wars. During these wars, the colonists were by far the most brutal in their tactics, but during the King Philip's War in 1672, the natives finally realized what was needed to win a colonial war. And it was not pretty. The news in Salem talked about and framed the natives for a lot of the atrocities. Of course, they were very one-sided and not mention anything negative that the settlers did. And although these stories were not fair in any way, the fear the news caused was very real, and the average Salem settler was very afraid. What happened in the King Philip's War is that it spread all across the colonies, and settlers' towns were burned, massacres were occurring, and people were being slaughtered. And these horror stories came to Salem. The refugees came to Salem. Salem built a palisade wall just to keep out the violence. But then people from Salem were sent to fight. They described the battle as absolutely horrific. In terms of the casualties to the proportion of the population, the King Philip's War is the deadliest war in American history. By some estimates, more than half of the New England settlements were attacked or totally decimated. It left a deep impression on everyone involved, and even those who had just heard about it. Another thing is that the Puritans believed that the Lord was punishing them for something. You're probably wondering, when did the witches come in? Well, for that we'll have to understand the colonial view of witchcraft, which was very different from the modern day view of witchcraft. They believed that a person who was a witch had quite literally been visited by the devil, who handed them a contract and signed up to be a witch. Now you might wonder, why would anyone think that anyone would do such a thing? Sell your soul and work for the devil? Well, the deal was, as they believed it, was to destroy Puritan religion and culture, and to do so he gave you special powers. They believed that the benefit of doing these things was that they could use their own powers in their own time to settle their own scores and improve their own lives. Now let's head to 1692, to the start of the actual trials. Two young girls named Betty and Abigail Paris began exhibiting strange, inexplicable behaviors. Many doctors had visited the girls, and they could not find a diagnosis, until one doctor visited them, and they were diagnosed with bewitchment. Many modern theories suggest that the girls were suffering from epilepsy, boredom, child abuse, mental illness, or even a disease brought on by eating rye infected with fungus. And according to the History of Massachusetts blog, sheer vindictiveness is now considered a plausible explanation as well. When they were asked who did this to them, the girls responded by accusing three ladies named Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba. Sarah Good was a known beggar, and she would go into the town with her 4-year-old daughter, yelling at people for not giving her money and other things. Tituba was a slave who was loved by all the children, but she was hated by a lot of the townsfolk. Sarah Osborne had multiple marriages, which was severely frowned upon by the Puritans. The girls offered no tangible evidence of them doing anything, but instead used spectral evidence, which was evidence in the forms of dreams and visions. In the English tradition, although the rules of evidence were vague, legal experts insisted on a clear and convincing proof of a crime. So-called spectral evidence was not accepted as evidence. Yet in 1662, Sir Matthew Hale solidified the legal credibility of spectral evidence in witchcraft cases by allowing it in the Bury St. Edmunds case in England, thus setting a precedent to be used in Salem, 1692. Sir Matthew went on to write a book called Trial by the Witches, published in 1682. The Salem witchcraft trials of 1692 happened at the worst possible time, considering everything that had just happened. A new charter arrived from England in May 1692, along with the new governor. But as yet, the General Court had not had any time to create any laws. Nevertheless, the new governor created a special court, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to deal with the witchcraft cases. Bearing false witness and committing perjury were considered felonies in Salem. Under normal conditions, those convicted of charges were prosecuted in public forums. During the witch trials, however, individuals convicted of perjury prosecuted could save themselves from public humiliation by accusing their neighbors. The Puritans believed physical realities had spiritual causes. For example, if the crops failed, the devil may have played a role. With this worldview, it was not a stretch for them to accept spectral evidence during the Salem witch trials. All three women who were accused were tried. During the trial, Tituba confessed to seeing a man and the devil in the form of a black dog who forced her to make a deal with him. The other two Sarahs both pleaded innocent, but all three were found guilty. Sarah Good got sentenced to execution in a later trial. Sarah Osborne died in prison, and Tituba was eventually pardoned. But what was happening from the judge's point of view? What was their thought process to allow this to happen? The judges of the Court of Oyer believed that they were cleansing the earth of witches and witchcraft. They thought that these witches were Satan's army, and the witches were causing all sorts of evil mischief throughout Salem. So when they would sentence witches, they didn't think that they were sacrificing innocent blood for unhinged and sickening purposes. They thought that they were being some sort of anti-hero for the public. They believed that they were called upon by God to do these things. Now, let's move on to the first person to get executed, Bridget Bishop. In Salem folklore, she is portrayed as a feisty, fun-loving, lusty innkeeper who cannot seem to keep herself out of trouble. Recently, historians have painted a somewhat different picture, owing to the confusion that with Sarah Bishop, who also appears in the court records of the witch triage before she went into the trial that would lead her to her execution. Her previous husband had actually accused her of witchcraft. However, she was not found guilty during that trial, but it definitely put her on the bad side of the Puritans. So when rumors of her doing witchcraft circulated, it was no surprise that the townsfolk put her on trial. During that trial, she was found guilty, and she was hung. What was really depressing about these particular cases, the ones where the accused was found guilty, was that they often did not plead guilty or knowingly falsely accuse others, even if it could save their lives. They didn't do this because they believed it was a sin to confess to being a witch, even if you weren't one. In the end, over 200 people were jailed for witchcraft, 19 were executed, at least 5 of them died in prison. The Salem witch trials officially started and ended from late June 1692 to May 1693. After the Court of Oyer was disbanded, the Massachusetts legal system arose. All of this happened over the course of 1 year. The Salem witch trials had huge and invaluable consequences both politically and legally. For starters, it implemented changes in court procedures such as the right to legal representation, cross-examination of accusers, and the presumption of innocence, also known as innocent until proven guilty. It also led to legal breakthroughs such as the rejection of spectral evidence and the idea that it is better to let a criminal go free than an innocent person face unjust consequences. Massachusetts pardoned the victims and compensated the victims' family in 1706. They also did not have a public apology until 1957. It also inspired the play The Crucible. We can't change the past. We can't alter what our ancestors went through. All we can do is study the past. Try to see it through the lives of those we study and learn from them. Try so we can learn from the mistakes of our ancestors to protect our future. We were given the rights to the future by the hands of those before us. It is our responsibility to ensure those same rights are protected for our future generations. This was Puritans and Prejudice. Good night. Written and directed by Allison Taylor. Music written and played by Allison Taylor. Sources most used: Salem Archive, Salem Witch Museum, and Britannica. Special thanks to Family Search, with which I found out that I am directly related to several important figures regarding the trials.